My grandparents had passed away within a few months of each other, leaving their house empty. There was talk of renting it out initially, but because of its poor state of disrepair, the family decided against it. No consensus about what to do with it could be arrived at. Therefore, it would be left to decay for another decade or more before I would stumble upon it. My aunt and I were going through my mother's things and discovered an old family photo album. Mom had gone off on one of her journeys, and no one was sure if she'd ever return. Her and I had been having an on and off relationship for years, so there was a lot about the family I didn't know. I came across a picture of her and I when I was just a baby, but I didn't recognize the house we were standing in front of. I inquired and my aunt told me about the old Wheeler family house that had once belonged to her parents. No one had been there in over a decade, and she wasn't even sure it was still standing. So, after a half an hour of badgering, she agreed to take me out to see it. That following morning, we headed out of town through 30 miles of cornfields until we came to a turnoff that led down a long, weedy gravel road. As we crested the hill, I was taken aback. The house I saw before me, despite being run down, was still breathtaking. In its prime, it must have been the finest home in the county. My aunt pulled up within a few yards of it, and we got out. From what I could see, nobody but the occasional mowing company had been there in a very long time. I couldn't help but be in awe of the place. The vibrant pink and blue paint had long faded from its soaring towers and the massive porch that was beginning to sag in a few places. Before I entered, I wanted to take in every bit of the wonderful facade as I could. Around the back was the remnants of the old horseshoe pit, and what I was told, my grandfather's Ford pickup. Although the big house had long seen its best days, I knew I hadn't seen anything that could have compared. Maybe one of those beautiful Victorian mansions in San Francisco. Even those would be dwarfed in comparison to this. When I was ready, we climbed the concrete steps and entered through the back entrance. From the moment we cracked the door, we were overwhelmed by a hideous smell coming from inside. We assumed it was a normal part of having a house sealed for so long and continued with our search. Everything appeared as if it had just been left where it was on my grandmother's last day, almost like a time capsule or a museum. The lights were even still working. Only later did I discover that my mother had been paying the bills all these years in hopes somebody would return and live there someday. Walking from room to room and seeing all the beautiful antique furnishing, I couldn't stop wondering why I had never been told about the house. Regardless of our frequent estrangements, I would have helped my mother with the upkeep of it. It was downright insane to me to leave such a beautiful place to rot. Then again, my mother's strange ways were the main reason of our frequent falling outs. As we made our way to the second floor, the smell only got worse. I suggested we cut our visit short and just take a quick look around. Every door was closed, so I went for the closest one and stuck my head in. This must have been a guest room or spare. Upon the bed laid a beautiful and elaborate, quite easily over 100 years old. My aunt was going through a cedar chest in the room next to me. I joined her, and we discovered another, much older photo album and decided to bring it back with us to look at later. She closed the door behind us, and I made my way toward the last room. Unfortunately, the closer I got to the door, the stronger the smell got. I was reluctant to open it, but I thought if the poor critter was where I could get to it, I'd take it outside and give it a good burial. Cracking the door, the stench slapped me in the face, and I lost focus for a moment. When I regained my composure, I was met with a terrible sight. Before me was not a dead forest creature, but a human being. The bloated body, now unrecognizable, laid curled up, slightly on the bed. I could feel my knees begin to buckle, so I turned as quickly as possible away and out of the room. My aunt was confused by my behavior and stuck her head in before yanking it out quickly again. We both ran down the stairs where the smell was less potent, and I called 911. The officers spent a few minutes in the room before coming back out with a small piece of paper and a driver's license. One of them joined us at the table where we were sitting and asked a few questions about my mother. This made me nervous, and I began demanding he explain himself. A serious look came across his face, and he told us that the body appeared to belong to my mother. I didn't want to believe it at first, but when he handed me her license, I knew it was true. My aunt and I held each other for a long time and cried. The officer gave us a few moments before interjecting himself again. Then he asked me if I knew why she would take her own life. I had naturally assumed Mom had died in her sleep. She was an older woman, but the note he handed me made everything clear. She had been depressed for a long time because of our being at odds with each other, and the last time we spoke, some things were said she feared she couldn't take back. The morning after our argument, she decided to return to the only place she'd ever been happy. Although she claimed to not be sure of what she was going to do at the time, the poor state of house just sent her over the edge. The last sentence asked that I not blame myself for her death, and that I move on with my life. The ending read simply, "Goodbye, Mom." A couple of weeks later, after everybody had time to deal with their grief, I brought the remaining family members together. After seeing the old house and realizing how poor the condition of it, and that it hurt my mother, I proposed that we try to raise the money to renovate it. In light of what had just occurred, I wanted to, at least, try to create something positive from our tragedy. I was giving their blessing and went to work. It took some time, but on the first day of spring, 2018, the Historical Society allowed me to lead the first tour of the newly restored Wheeler Mansion. A great day could have been much better had my mother been there with me. No matter our differences, it was her who inspired me and the only one who truly made it all possible. For the hunting season of 2017, I got in on a lease with a guy from work. I didn't have time to check the area out before the season started, so the inevitable occurred and I got lost my first day. That morning, I left the camp just before dawn. I'm not the kind that hunts from a stand. I'm your traditional stalk and shoot type of hunter. Since I wasn't familiar with the lease and I, stupidly, left my GPS back at the camp, I had to stick to the main paths in order to not get lost. Most of the morning, I did well. However, as I grew tired, I lost focus and veered from the trail. In my defense, I came across this really fresh set of tracks. Of course I had to follow them. The sucky thing was that they continued onto a neighboring property, and I had to stop following. When I looked up, I realized I was way off the trail, and I did not know how to get back. The rest of the day was spent trying to find my way back to camp. About an hour before dark, I noticed a rundown house or cabin in the distance. By now, I wasn't sure whose property I was on. I hoped that if somebody was living there, they could help me. But as I got closer, I could tell the place had been abandoned for a good while. I knocked to make sure, but with no reply, I made myself at home. My first goal was to get a fire going. After I did that, I began combing through the cabinets for food or other things that I thought could help me. Not much, but a questionable can of chili and some candles were found. I heated up the chili over the fire and combined it with a half-eaten bag of chips. After dinner, I looked through the bedroom and discovered an old map of the area. I wasn't sure how accurate it would be after all that time, but I was happy to find it. I spread it out on the floor in front of the fireplace and planned my course for the morning. I was shocked to see I had veered off over 5 miles from where I'd started. At some point, I must have dozed off. During the night, I had a super vivid dream that a man was sitting in the chair next to me, just staring. The guy never said a word. When I jerked awake and saw that I was alone, I was relieved and quickly fell back asleep. The following morning, I woke up at 6:15 and got my stuff together. I made sure the fire was completely put out and headed back to camp. I just stepped out from the house when I came face to face with a strange man. The guy from my dream, in fact. I was confused at first, but when he spoke, I knew my dream had really happened. This man was holding an old Marlin 30-30, not an odd sight for a hunter during deer season. This dude did not look like a hunter though. He wore old dirty backpack and normal bright yet dingy street clothes. His eyes had a very crazed look to them that made me uncomfortable to gaze at. I was surprised but regained my calm and said, "Good morning." Instead of saying it back, he just stared at me with his crazed black eyes. I began to say something else, but he interrupted and asked what I was doing in the cabin. Before I could answer, he blurted out that it was his place. I continued and explained what had happened the day before. The entire time I was telling him, he was gripping the rifle so tightly, his knuckles were white. His behavior was beginning to scare me. The only thing I wanted to do was go back to camp and then home. The last word had barely left my lips before he angrily told me that it was his place. It appeared to have been empty for quite a while, but I wasn't going to argue with him. I apologized as quickly as I could and went on my way. For a good 100 yards or more, I kept looking behind me. I was waiting to get shot in the back. Every time I looked back, he was staring, maniacally, back at me, death gripping his gun. It took a couple of hours for me to find my way back. By then, I'd have plenty of time to dwell upon our encounter, and I was fully freaked out. The guys that were still in camp were happy to see me and asked what had happened. I just said I got lost and camped out for the night, never mentioning the nutcase I met. I doubt they'd take it seriously anyhow. The whole experience had me so scared, I wanted nothing more than to get home. The other guys must have thought I was crazy. After throwing all my stuff into the back of my truck, I tore off out of there and never returned. I knew I'd never be able to feel safe knowing that Kook was somewhere out in the woods, possibly watching me. That following Monday, my friend asked what had caused me to leave so abruptly. I had made up some lie about my wife being sick. I'm not sure he believed it. Nothing was said about it again, and maybe things are better that way.